Hello. This lecture video discusses bias, which Behrens and Russo discuss in pages 68 through 81 of the textbook. You might be wondering why we've jumped to chapter 4 to start our discussion of bias and how it relates to evidence-based decision-making. You might have noticed in chapter 2, the authors discuss assumptions, which can lead to bias. And in chapters 3 and 4, the authors cover additional portions of bias as well. We'll cover those in a future module. Throughout those first few chapters, though, the authors make it clear that human judgment is prone to bias. In this way, bias can negatively affect decision-making. Since the purpose of this class is for us to be able to gather evidence to make the best decisions possible, we first have to be able to recognize our own biases and be aware of how that might affect our decision-making in various circumstances. So this is important work for us to do regularly in each module and throughout this class, at work, and in our everyday lives. So along these lines, I invite you throughout this video and throughout the course to consider how bias appears in your everyday life. This includes in your workplace, in the context of this course, and in your personal life as well. So we'll be revisiting bias in Module 2, and then throughout future chapters. And not surprisingly, it will also be included in your final project, the critically appraised topic, which is due at the end of the semester. Before moving on in this video, at the end of this slide, I'll ask that you pause the video for a moment and consider the following. Think very briefly about your current or desired future workplace and brainstorm and consider what a possible problem is that might need to be addressed in that particular context. For example, I'll expand my example from my chapters 1 and 2 lecture video. I spoke of students on academic probation as being a common problem for academic advising. In this example, my workplace is academic advising, or perhaps more broadly, academic affairs. The problem is students on probation, more specifically, students on probation being more likely to depart from the institution. So for me, the problem that needs to be addressed would be students in poor academic standing. So I'll be looking for a solution to help them improve their particular academic standing. So like I mentioned before, please pause the video for a few moments and reflect on your current workplace or your future desired workplace to identify a problem that exists. And once you've come up with that problem within your workplace, then restart the video. You will use that problem throughout. All right, as you restart the video, you should have identified a problem, again, in your current or future workplace. As I mentioned, you'll continue to use that example throughout this video to practice applying bias. So if you've not stopped to come up with a problem in your workplace, please do pause the video and take a minute or two to brainstorm. It will make this video more impactful for you. But for now, we'll go ahead and turn our attention to the different types of cognitive biases that the chapter talks about. The chapter mentions many different cognitive biases for us to be aware of and gives pretty clear definitions of each. So I'll briefly go through these to make sure that we're all on the same page. The first bias that the authors discuss is patternicity. They talk about humans tending to seek pattern in their daily lives. And because of this tendency, we're quick to assume a causal relationship. For example, because A happened, it might have caused B, even if that might not be the case, or if B was bound to happen anyways. So one example the book gives is perhaps you've eaten a certain food before and then gotten sick. You might assume that that's a pattern being formed and that food is what made you become sick, even if you would have become sick either way. But we might see that as a pattern, and then you might stay away from that particular food in order to try to prevent illness. The second form of bias discussed in the book is confirmation bias, which focuses on humans' natural tendency to want to confirm their own beliefs. The book highlights this as being one of the most critical biases for us to be aware of and recommends that in order to help counteract confirmation bias, that you search for contradicting beliefs or contradictory explanations. This will help you avoid ignoring information simply because it doesn't support your beliefs. The third bias mentioned is group conformity. As it sounds, this is a tendency to want to conform or follow the group. To me, this particular form of bias can be especially relevant if you're newer to a particular workplace Perhaps you have less experience than some of the people in the group that you're working in, or you're feeling like you need to be accepted for a certain reason. Or if 9 out of 10 people in a group all feel a certain way, it can be hard to be the 10th person that says, I disagree. So this can be an important one to simply be aware of. It might change from situation to situation or depending on what group you're a part of. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to disagree in front of everybody, but maybe after the group meeting, you could voice your concerns in a one-on-one setting with your supervisor or with a colleague that you trust. So there's different ways to work to counter this particular form of bias. Availability bias involves being more likely to believe something if you can quickly locate information that supports your belief. This is similar to confirmation bias. You want to be sure that you do an extensive search for different types of information and contradictory information to see if you can counter what your belief is. Authority bias is when we overvalue the opinions of leaders or authority. So sometimes we're more likely to accept a particular belief as closer to fact if it's coming from somebody that's higher up than us or somebody that has a little bit more experience. Outcome bias is when we rely too heavily on a particular outcome to determine what is true or not. This becomes a problem when the outcome could have happened by chance. It might have happened regardless of a certain intervention. So say that we set up an intervention to solve problem A and it results in outcome B, but that outcome might have happened anyways. I'll give an example of this in just a bit. Overconfidence bias is when we're likely to overvalue our own knowledge or understanding of a situation. So again, this one's a very personal bias that we want to be aware of. And we want to make sure that we're engaging with our colleagues. So we're hearing our colleagues' opinions as well and digging for other types of counter information so that we make sure that we've covered all of our bases. And then the last form of cognitive bias discussed in the book is social desirability bias, which is similar in ways to group conformity. This is the tendency to answer questions in a way that will be viewed favorably by others. So in a way that would allow you to be more socially desirable. So we're now going to take a second here to work on applying cognitive biases to that problem that you identified earlier in the video. From the list that we just covered that also appears at the bottom of the slide, what we'll ask you to do is pause the video and choose 2 biases from the list below and apply them to your current or future workplace and that problem that you brainstormed at the beginning of the video. And you'll want to do this to determine how these biases might influence how you or others think of that particular problem. And please resume the video once you've reflected on 2 forms of bias and how they relate to your problem. All right, welcome back. I hope you were able to connect 2 forms of bias to your situation. I'll quickly provide an example related to my own ongoing students on academic probation example. Say the institution is wanting to implement an intervention that provides study skills for students that were on probation in the previous semester with the goal of helping students improve their GPA. We might assume the intervention leads to the improved GPA, but as it turns out, maybe the students in the second semester changed their major or their class schedule to better align with their strengths and interests. Maybe they decided to attend 100% of classes versus the previous semester when they skipped every other class. And maybe in the semester they learned they have to turn in all their assignments. It's quite possible in the second semester with any or all of those factors that the student would have been successful without that study skills program. So this is a form of outcome bias where we might assume the intervention led to the particular outcome, but perhaps it did not. In this case, we'd want to gather evidence from the students. They would be stakeholders, from the institution, the organization, maybe that's on the major change, the class schedule, and continue to dig into other possible solutions as well. We could then offer all of those solutions to students on probation instead of just that study skills course. So the book then talks about considering how we can work to avoid bias. This is, again, work that we need to do in an ongoing manner. The book discusses a few different ways that we can reduce bias, and some of them overlap one another quite a bit. So this slide will provide a summary of a few of the methods to reduce bias. The first way that we can work to avoid bias or reduce bias is to consider multiple options. Similar to my example on the previous slide, it's recommended that you brainstorm numerous solutions and they're possible outcomes, whether they're similar or different. So instead of just thinking of the study skills option, I might also think about how I would talk to students about the importance of reading the syllabus at the beginning of the class, or perhaps changing their major to better align with interests or strengths. Um, Maybe those would work better or the same as the study skills approach, but we would want to consider those multiple options. The second way to reduce bias is to gather evidence before forming an opinion. This shouldn't be surprising to you in a course called Evidence-Based Decision-Making that this appears on the list. Here you'll want to search for evidence that supports your claim. We will be doing this throughout our future modules. The book also talks about blind assessment, which is where you would remove different types of identifiable information so that you're not biased towards the information source. You'd simply be looking at the information presented. Blind assessment is talked about a lot in human resource departments when considering hiring processes and how to remove implicit bias. So one option that HR departments often go to is to remove names, emails, and addresses from resumes and cover letters of applicants. They might even consider removing position titles in previous organizations, only leaving the person's skills and abilities. This can lead to fewer unconscious biases related to names, as you might be more favorable to people whose names are of a similar ethnic origin to your own, or perhaps bias towards a location. I might be less interested in interviewing someone that lives out of state, even if that's the strongest applicant in the pool. So you could consider a blind assessment along the way if it's appropriate to your particular type of problem. The last bucket that the book talks about is seeking disagreement and playing devil's advocate. In these different examples the book gives, essentially you would be working to counter whatever intervention or solution is being considered. You can do this with yourself, or you can do this with a group as well, but you would search for various reasons that something may be a good option or a bad option, or for multiple solutions as well. So we'll wrap the video up here, but as we do so, I would like you to please consider that same example that you've carried throughout the video, the problem in your future or current workplace, and think about how you can work to avoid bias related to your workplace. So take one of these methods on the screen here and apply it to that problem that you've been working on throughout the video. So you can see if any of these would help avoid bias. So I used the outcome bias for my advising example, and then I discussed how I might consider multiple options that could result in improving a student's GPA. So please do take a minute and think about how you might work to avoid bias, and we'll end our video here.